What does it mean to live inside an unfinished story? To live without knowing how or when it will end? When will this finally be over is a question we Jews have been asking for centuries, and it's a question anyone asks when life becomes difficult. You're listening to Torah in 7, a podcast by Lubavitch International where we explore the story behind the story of the weekly Torah reading. I'm your host, Bela Olidort. Parshat Vayechi brings the book of Breshit to a close. Yaakov, nearing the end of his life in Egypt, asks to be buried in the land of Canaan. He blesses Yosef's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, placing his right hand on the younger child. He gathers all his sons and speaks to each of them, offering words of blessing, warning, and prophecy about the future of the tribes. Yaakov dies, and Yosef and the family bring him to be buried in the cave of Machpelah. After his death, the brothers fear that Yosef will take revenge, but Yosef reassures them and continues to provide for them. The Parsha and the book of Breshit end with Yosef's death in Egypt, and with his request that when God redeems the people, his bones be carried up from there. Parshat Vayechi is what is known as a Parsha Stuma, a closed or blocked section in the Torah. Unlike all the other Torah portions where there's an open space that appears between the end of one parsha and the beginning of the next, here that space is closed, it's blocked. The text moves forward without pause. This points to something deeper that I'd like to unpack here. Let's begin. Before he dies, Yaakov gathers his children and says, I will tell you what will happen at the end of days, ba'acharit hayamim. Yaakov's children, who are about to enter a long and bitter period of suffering, know that they will eventually be redeemed. They know God's promise to their grandfather Avraham. What Yaakov wants, says Rashi, was to reveal the ketz hayamim, the time of their redemption. But at that moment, the divine presence departs from him. Yaakov cannot tell them when it will end. Call it prophet's block. Instead, he speaks to them about their character, their strengths, their failures, and the paths their lives will take. He offers blessing and warning, but the knowledge of the end is withheld. Something similar happens centuries later to the prophet Daniel. He is shown sweeping visions of exile and redemption, and he asks the most natural question, how long will this be? He is told, go, Daniel, the words are sealed until the end of time, or the time of the end. Again, the knowledge is withheld, which makes me ask, wouldn't it be better to know, wouldn't that kind of clarity make the suffering easier to bear? Classical Greek tragedy imagines precisely such a world. In the most famous example, Oedipus is told clearly and definitively how his story will unfold. He knows the inevitability of his fate, but that knowledge doesn't save him, it traps him. Every attempt to escape only drives the story forward until freedom collapses under the weight of what cannot be avoided. The Torah refuses to create that kind of world. Redemption is promised, but it's never scripted. The destination is known, but the path is not. Human action is not swallowed by the end, it is invited into it. Because once the ending is fully known, the middle no longer demands courage. It becomes something to endure, rather than a place where choice still has meaning. The Torah gives language to this idea in the book of Bamidbar, when it describes the 40-year journey through the desert. Along the way, the people stop many times, and at each stop, they rebuild the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and set up camp with total focus on the present. Traveling in this way becomes integral to the journey, where, as the Talmud notes, these encampments were not treated as temporary way stations, but rather as places of settlement. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe drew something striking from this. Exile, he insisted, is not a pause in life. Even when we know that we are on the way somewhere else, the journey itself is where life is meant to be lived. Each stop matters. Every day matters. Each moment carries responsibility. The Rebbe placed enormous emphasis on the redemption, on the coming of Mashiach, but to the Rebbe, the anticipation was never an escape from the present or a way of postponing responsibility. It was rather the greatest incentive to act in the here and now. What we do in the unfinished story, he taught us, is not incidental to redemption. It helps bring it about. The choices we make, the actions we take, the way we insist on meaning and moral responsibility, even in exile or especially in exile, these help bring redemption itself into being. Holocaust survivor Primo Levi noticed this firsthand. In his book, The Drowned and the Saved, he observed that those who endured were often not the ones fixated on how long the suffering would last. The lager had no future, he wrote. The prisoner who allowed himself to think about the future was lost. Survival, he explained, favored those who were able to hold on to small acts of responsibility and meaning in the present, even without any timetable for relief. That focus, the ability to stay in the present, is what helped them make it to the end. Vayechi closes the book of Breshit without answering the question that a people about to enter centuries of exile most want answered. How long will this last? Instead, it leaves them and us today inside the journey itself. Today, when Jews feel unsettled and exposed in a world that has turned hostile, the impulse is often to want out of history, out of the challenge, out of the waiting. But Vayechi offers no such escape. It asks us not to control how the story ends, but to live responsibly in the middle, to act with agency in the space we do control, and to let the future grow out from there. Bereshit is a book of beginnings, the story of individuals and families, of relationships and moral struggle that shape identity before we become a people. Next week, we open the book of Shmot, a different book, a different tone. Bereshit ends quietly with a family gathered around a bed. Shmot begins with a people stepping onto the stage of history, and the unfinished story continues. If you found this meaningful, please hit the subscribe button. Shabbat Shalom.